Hi everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Human Trafficking Hater. In the first episode of this series on the Ukraine-Russia war, I covered the vulnerabilities that place refugees at a significant risk of being trafficked. In this episode, we will look at the other refugee crises around the world. This will help us to better understand what awaits Ukrainian refugees as they spend more time being refugees. This will also help to show how other groups have been trafficked while seeking refuge in another country. Now, on with the episode. As the Syria crisis enters its 11th year, the humanitarian situation is more difficult than ever. An estimated 13 million people need humanitarian assistance, and more than half of the population remains displaced from their homes. This includes nearly 7 million refugees living in neighboring countries and millions more who are internally displaced inside Syria. Women and children comprise more than 2/3 of those displaced. Within Syria, children find themselves being labor trafficking victims as they are forced into war as child soldiers. The U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons report lists Syria as a Tier 3 country for its government's contribution to trafficking, including using child soldiers and taking no actions to prosecute any human traffickers within the entire country. At the same time, traffickers are taking advantage of this highly vulnerable population. Syrian children are at risk for multiple forms of trafficking, including forced marriages, sex trafficking, and forced begging. The Syrian refugee population is highly vulnerable to sex trafficking and forced labor in neighboring countries as well, particularly Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. One example is in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, where Syrian gangs force refugee men, women, and children to work in agriculture under harsh conditions, including physical abuse and with little to no pay. 8 years of war have forced 4 million Yemenians to flee their homes because of the crisis. 79% of them are women and children. Since the escalation of armed conflict in March 2015, human rights organizations reported all parties to the conflict continued their unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. The trafficking of children in Yemen is not limited to forcing kids into conflict. An international organization reported armed groups use boys mostly in combat roles to guard checkpoints, but also to force other children to carry out support duties such as cooking and washing clothes. Boys are not the only ones suffering within Yemen, as girls are forced into roles as medics and into forced marriages as well. Despite the conflict, Yemen hosts 137,000 refugees and asylum seekers from Somalia and Ethiopia, making it the world's second largest host of Somali refugees. 63% of South Sudanese refugees are children. Add in women, and the total is 80%. That means 8 out of 10 refugees from South Sudan are either a woman or a child. There are nearly 2.3 million displaced refugees from South Sudan. These individuals have been forced into the refugee life because of extreme violence in the form of physical and sexual assaults. Unfortunately, in neighboring countries and refugee camps, they do not find accommodations that meet basic living standards. During the rainy season, camps for South Sudanese refugees have limited supplies, such as coal and fuel, because of limited road accessibility. Additionally, the majority of South Sudanese children in Kenya's Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps only have access to primary education. These are not isolated issues, because a majority of South Sudanese refugees live in camps, with only 8% living in individual accommodations. Afghans have suffered more than 40 years of conflict, natural disasters, chronic poverty, food insecurity, and most recently the COVID-19 pandemic. Before the invasion of Ukraine displaced more than 6 million people, Afghan refugees were the third largest displaced population in the world, following Syrian refugees and displaced Venezuelans. The vast majority of refugees from Afghanistan are living in Pakistan and Iran, which continue to host more than 1.4 million and 780,000 registered Afghan refugees. Of the nearly 6 million Afghans who have been forcibly displaced from their homes, 3.5 million are displaced within Afghanistan. 2.6 million are Afghan refugees living in other countries. For those living outside the country, they face the same issues as other groups of refugees, which includes finding safety, shelter, work, and food. Even the 80,000 Afghans who have made it to the United States are struggling to acquire these necessities. There may be as many as 4,000 in the United States who are still without permanent housing as they stay in hotels. These refugees have been in hotels for months after living on military bases for several more months. The inability for thousands to be able to settle in the United States highlights how difficult it is for refugees to maintain a lifestyle that includes the basic necessities. In the few countries I reviewed here, it didn't matter whether it was Yemen or Syria or deep into Africa with South Sudan. I found that women and children are the ones who bear most of the burden as refugees. I also found that being a refugee is usually not a short-term affair, with many struggling to find food and shelter for years. Their vulnerable situations place them at an increased risk of being trafficked into both labor and sex trafficking. Around the world, there are other countries that have millions of citizens fleeing into a refugee life. From Eritrea and Sudan to Venezuela, the problem is swelling to never-before-seen numbers. In 2022, there may be for the first time ever more than 30 million refugees spread across the world, and another 50 million who are internally displaced within their own country. That means 1 out of every 95 people on the planet are living some sort of refugee life. All of these individuals are fleeing horrible situations and walking into situations where traffickers are aware that they are experiencing increased vulnerabilities and looking to exploit them. That's all for this episode, but if you want to learn more about the specific countries that Ukrainian refugees are fleeing into and the risks and challenges that will be faced in each country, then click the subscribe button now, because the next episode in this series will look at the risks of being trafficked in the countries where many refugees are fleeing to, and you don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.